Morning, everyone. This is such an honor and a pleasure to be with you today and to be introducing our guest speaker, Moshe Safdie. And of course, we all know him as a renowned architect, especially of Habitat 67. And we were having a little nostalgic Expo 67 moment before this all started. And he's one of the most acclaimed and influential architects in the world. So it's quite something that we're all here together. He's an urban planner, an educator. He's taught at Yale, McGill, and Harvard that I know of. Theorist, author, of course, a role model and a mentor, but best of all, a McGill graduate and a great human being. Moshe is the recipient of many architectural, academic, and civic accolades, including several honorary doctorates and the Order of Canada. Born and raised in Israel, Moshe came to Canada when he was 16 years old and attended Westmount High School before being accepted to McGill in the Bachelor of Architecture program, which was a 6-year program. He's had an extraordinary career, and he'll have the pleasure of going through his presentation shortly. His wide range of completed projects around the world, motivated by social concerns of architecture and formal experimentation, include cultural, educational, and civic institutions, neighborhoods and public parks, housing, mixed-use urban centers, and even an airport or two. He is with us today to share the ideals and principles of his iconic project that we all know as Habitat 67, an adaptation of his undergraduate thesis and a turning point in modern architecture. Moshe, the floor is yours.
Thank you. A pleasure to be joining you this morning. I thought today as a kind of a way to open a discussion about the issues of housing and urbanism that face us today, to walk you through a journey that began at McGill and how it has evolved over the years in our practice, which is the quest for housing that's dense urban housing that goes beyond the current, let's call it standard apartment buildings as they prevail in our cities. But this whole journey begins at McGill. In my 5th year of 6, there was an announcement of a traveling scholarship that CMHC, Central Housing and Mortgage Corporation, would give one student from each school of architecture to travel around North America to study housing. I was lucky to get one from McGill, and 5 of us, there were 5 schools then, traveled through the United States and Canada. We visited mostly urban housing, was public housing. High-rise housing was quite scarce for luxury housing at the time. And this is one of many public housing projects that we visited. This is Chicago. And we also visited endless suburbs. It was the heyday of Levitt towns. And I came back with a report that said the suburban sprawl has fundamental issues of land waste, energy, the commuting it requires. But people prefer to live in suburbs because they want the house with their garden and the privacy and everything that comes with that kind of a dwelling, rather than an urban apartment. And my conclusion was we've got to rethink apartment buildings, reinvent the apartment. The idea was that we would industrialize the structure so that it's made up of prefabricated components, 3-dimensional elements that form part of the house, produced in a factory, lifted into place. This is a sketch of one of the systems in my thesis, showing how they're stacked within a frame, each with its own garden, a system of open streets leading to the units. And there is a model set on the slopes of Mount Royal Park as demonstration of what this would be like applied to a large site. I'll sort of go fast forward. My first, after being briefly employed by my thesis advisor, Sandy Van Ginkel, I proceeded to Philadelphia to work for the great American architect Louis Kahn. And while I was working there in 1963, Sandy Van Ginkel shows up and says, there's going to be a World's Fair in Montreal, and I'd like you to come and head the team that designs the master plan. And I accepted, and with a bit of nerve said, I have one condition. I want to continue developing my thesis. Perhaps it can be an appropriate pavilion for the World's Fair. I returned and worked on the master plan, and in parallel, we used funding that we got from the cement companies, working overtime at night, and developed the original habitat proposal, which you see here, of the entire Cité du Havre in Montreal becoming a community of 1,200 families, which rise 25 stories in a series of inclined membranes of housing, terraced housing, with the underside being the public realm with schools and some office space and shops and so on. Expo management was excited about it. Off we went to Ottawa to present it to the cabinet. The idea was that there would be a tax break for the developer who builds it as research, but that was not forthcoming. So the cabinet decided, we can't build the whole thing, we don't have time, but we're going to give you $15 million to build whatever you can. Believe it or not, I was deeply disappointed and slated not doing it at all, but I came to my senses by evening, and we realized that $5 million of that 15 would be to build a factory, to make the modules, but we revised the scheme to 150 stacked apartments, ranging in size. You see here the box being lifted in place, and also the prefabricated bathroom, which we designed, going into place. There were prefabricated kitchens. And here it is today, 60 years later, almost. It's a heritage building today. It's a very cohesive community. One thing that Habitat has proven is that it is a desirable place to live in. There's been many utopian projects, housing projects built over the 20th and 21st century. And many of them, maybe most of them, proved to be dystopian in the way it worked out in terms of living in them. And I think one thing about Habitat is that it is a project that has actually proven to be very desirable from the point of view of urban dwellers. But we went through several years following that many commissions, New York, Puerto Rico, Washington, US government, designing habitats that were not realized in the 1970s and early 1980s. And the question was, were these ideas either not realizable on a mass basis? They didn't jive with the economic realities of housing. There was a tendency to say this was one of a kind, interesting, but that's it. This was, I'll just show you a few images of the building today. It is in remarkably good shape for a 60-year-old aging lady. Concrete in our climate has its challenges, but you see it here with the patina of life People have modified the units and adapted it, and you certainly have the feeling of the kind of richness that comes out of the usage of the building. In 2009, after many years of hiatus in any housing activity, both not only in our own practice, but I'd say generally there was very little interest or academic interest in exploring new housing ideas. We set out a research program in our office to study how we would deal with habitat today. That was then 35, 40 years later. We recognize that the densities, this is Hong Kong, this is Singapore, that became the reality of many cities around the world, were many times higher than whatever we imagined in 1967 in Montreal. That two new phenomena have emerged: mixed use, mixing in single developments, offices, retail, and housing, and densities which reached floor coverage of 15, 18. These are densities of the downtown of Hong Kong and Midtown New York and so on. And so what would we do today as we were addressing this? This shows you the dozens of models that we made exploring multiple concepts and systems, and I'll show you a couple of those as they emerge. One approach was, can we simplify habitat into a vertical structure with vertical plumbing, none of the acrobatics of the original structure, and prefabricated out of panels rather than boxes, and thus maybe achieve economies over what we had built in 67. This is the rendering of the possible building that would emerge, where most units or all units still have gardens, they still have multiple orientations, but certainly a much simpler and easier building to build. We were hoping that we could achieve economies by this kind of simplification. Another system was to try and replicate the density of Midtown Manhattan, which you see here, and we proceeded to map the mix of apartment buildings, office buildings, and some retail in several blocks of Midtown Manhattan, and reorganize the same program in a three-dimensional structure that was aiming to achieve some of the qualities of habitat. So on the right, you see a diagram which shows you office structures in red, retail at ground level and mid-level in the building, and then this is a 75-story structure with terraced housing and hotels and other urban uses above, translating into this model, which shows you a permeable structure with these large urban windows, which would prevent this from becoming a wall in the city. Say if it was built along a river or Central Park, that you could still have permeability through it. And yet many large, expansive spaces of the public realm on the various levels. You see here the terracing for the apartments and the balconies and the large playgrounds and public areas on the 25th and 50th level serve the community. And so this was a demonstration that you could achieve these much higher densities and mixed use and still have the quality of life, although I'd call it quality of life of habitat on steroids in a much more intense urban setting. What was fascinating in the years that followed is that there was a renewed interest in housing that went beyond the standard apartment building. And our own office was commissioned so that from that research models, many projects have spun off in real life. This is Qinghuandao in China, a coastal city near Beijing. This is a project being built for a developer, Carey Development Group, which owns the Shangri-La Hotel. And this is middle-income housing. We built the first section completed about 6-7 years ago, which is totally sold out and inhabited. We're currently doubling the complex, so there'll be some 6,000 apartments inhabited along the coast, terracing. It is conventionally built, it is not prefabricated, and yet we've managed to achieve, I think, a quality of life that transcends, for those of you who've seen the standard apartment projects in China, it's a major departure in terms of what it offers. And in Singapore, again, I'm emphasizing in this case, middle-income housing, a complex built by capital land so that it's not subsidized, it's not HDB, Housing Development Board, it's actually middle-income marketplace housing, 600 families. And what we've done here, given that this is inhabited by families, created 3 levels of public amenities with playgrounds and swimming pools. And these bridge across the towers. You can see again the terracing that provides both open gardens and balconies for the various units. This has now been up for about 8-9 years and has become a very desirable and cohesive community. And you see here the bridges, the balconies, and so on. One way to see how your projects are doing these days is to go to Instagram and TikTok, and you see what the residents are posting and what they're saying about where they're living. And so this is a little collection of some of that kind of life in the project. Also in Asia, Sri Lanka, in Colombo, we've just completed a structure that rises 65 stories high, and it has terraced apartments and some smaller apartment units. It overlooks the city and the sea. You see here the cross-section, photograph of the apartment, and also the cross-section through them, a view of one of the apartments with its terraces overlooking the harbor. And again, in this case, luxury housing, we've created the kind of environment that transcends the norm. I'll come back to Montreal and Habitat. As I mentioned, the government of the provincial government declared Habitat, I think it was about 8 years ago, as a heritage building. And it also declared my own apartment interior, the one I lived in while still in Montreal, as a heritage interior, except it had not, over the years with several tenants that I rented it to, it was not what it was in '67. And so after it became declared heritage building, I totally restored it back to exactly what it was in 1967. You see here the bare, unfurnished interiors, restoring also the fiberglass bathroom. I felt that this unit should be part of the public realm. It should be available to the public to visit. There's extraordinary demand all the time for not just architects, but people in general to visit the place. And so as part of my gifting of the archive to McGill, which has now been concluded, the apartment has become part of that archive, or part of at least the collection at McGill. It'll be open to the public for visits. It can be used for conferences. It can be used for visiting scholars. And so I hope that that will help to contribute to the promotion and dissemination of the idea to both architects, students of architecture, and just the public in general. And then coming full circle, we were approached a year ago by Epic Games. I don't know how many of you do video games. I discovered them when they approached us because I'm not a video. I'm beyond that generation of video games, but they suggested to us that they would digitize the original habitat design, the one that was not built, into a virtual reality and make it available as a complete 3D virtual reality environment to their subscribers so that become a setting for their games. Working with them over a year, we digitized the project that was actually done conventionally with hand drawings. When we did Habitat, there was no computers whatsoever, nor for drawing it up. But as it became digitized, it became possible for them to also go further. And what I'll be showing you now is a clip, which is in progress. It's not yet complete, where it will become completely detailed, including the interior of apartments. So their subscribers could walk around the project, walk into different apartments, and imagine their own worlds and events as they become part of that reality. Let's run it. So we have here a 60 years old concept, which if built today, I think would be considered timely and avant-garde. So maybe we still will get it built now that we have it in virtual reality.
Well, how much fun is that? I mean, would you ever imagine that you would have Epic Games approaching you and in this day and age, putting what your original concept was into something that everybody could see?
I mean, I not only didn't imagine, of course, we didn't know that such tools will be available when we designed Habitat, but even today, in terms of We do a lot of 3D imaging in our work, but this kind of virtual reality, I mean, you're seeing it on the screen, but eventually you'll be having your goggles and you'll actually be walking around there. This is like mind-boggling to me.
It is mind-boggling. And, you know, I had the pleasure of going through the archives the other day and looking at some of the drawings and the sketches and your thesis. And I mean, that were, you know, as you said, there weren't computers then, so everything was done by hand. And the other thing that I found interesting was that really what you're showing us today is captured in the archives. They're there at McGill and for all to see if you wish to see. Anyway, we'll get to that later with Tellina. But when you're looking back, because you have such a passion, and I'm trying to think, what was the spark, the actual spark that got you in, you know, thinking of architecture and applying to McGill in architecture, which of course then led to your thesis and led to Habitat and everything else that you've done. Was there something? Was there something?
Unlikely path. You know, I grew up in Israel in the formative years of the state. We were all we went to the youth movements. I was going to study agriculture and with my colleagues create some kind of a kibbutz somewhere and settle on the land. And then my parents decided to immigrate to Canada. And the idea of farming in Canada didn't quite resonate for me. And as I was completing the last year at Westmont, I did 2 years at Westmont High, they gave us an aptitude test. And it, you know, you filled all the questions, then it said, excels in mathematics, good in the arts, suitable for architecture. Now, I've thought back after, where did this all come from? On our way to Canada, my parents stopped over in Europe as we were waiting for our visas, and we spent 3 months, Rome, Milan, Paris, London, in which I visited cathedrals and churches and Hadrian's Villa and Versailles and all these amazing places. And I think that might have had something to do with it, but as soon as I saw that, suitable for architecture, said, oh, that's it. And I guess it was a few months after enrolling at McGill that I knew that that's it. And it became like I was totally drawn into it, and it became, in fact, I was kind of a mediocre student because I had never had too much interest in my studies until I, you know, studied architecture where I really cared about it. And it was a great, wonderful experience. And I also think back on the 6th year at McGill as being quite unique. We were a small school. We were 16 in the class. McGill graduated 16 architects per year at the time. We got a lot of attention. We had wonderful teachers. It was a very unique experience.
Yeah, and I think the scholarship that you received was also transformational, because you actually got out there in various cities across North America to study the housing, to look at the housing.
I mean, the very idea that 5 of us were, you know, really looking at housing. We had a faculty member from Toronto who really was a great guide, and also people opened doors to us so that various architectural offices, housing agencies opened the doors to us. And then we spent a few weeks in Ottawa at the offices of CMHC, and we saw the other side of it, the housing bureaucracy. But there was a great deal of idealism in the agency at the time. And, you know, going back to Expo and thinking of the circumstance of Habitat getting built, when it comes down to it, a bunch of civil servants like Ed Churchill, who came from the Corps of Engineers and others, accepted a project that extremely experimental and risky, and staked the reputation to get it built, proposed it to the federal government. I'm not sure that would happen easily today. I was, 25. I'd never built a building. There was a lot of courage on the parts of the decision makers and enthusiasm that I think was very much a mark of the time.
Yeah, very much. And I mean, back then you were thrown into the world stage very quickly at a very young age, and managed to excel through adversity, I'm sure, at that time.
I don't want to be, I'm not trying to promote my memoir, but my COVID project was writing a memoir which traces the professional side of my life. And I go through all the obstacles that presented themselves at the time once it was approved, like all the go, no go moments, and what followed, because to me, it's fascinating. It's not just having an idea, and it's not even getting it approved by someone, but managing to get it through the system. Is that I think is something that should be experienced and shared with certainly young architects and people who are joining the profession. I thought it would be important to share that with them.
Yeah, very important. And that, I was just thinking of the educational component, that you spend a lot of time with students, and
I'm still teaching, by the way.
I knew that. You're still at Harvard, right?
Well, I stopped teaching for many years, but in the last 3 years, I've been doing a one semester. Yeah.
Oh my gosh, those lucky students. But what would you say? What words of advice would you give to students that are graduating today?
In architecture?
Yes.
It's a tough profession. So, the first thing I must say to them, it's a tough profession. It's an underpaid profession. Young architects go for years being, I guess the honest way to put it is exploited, because they're paid, they work harder than lawyers and other professionals, and they probably get half the compensation. So you have to be passionate and you have to be patient. But the rewards of seeing people, experience the buildings that you conceive once you have succeeded in getting something realized are amazing. It's just like you see the impact that you have on people's lives. But it's a tough one, and therefore you've got to be very committed.
Yeah, very, very much so. One of the things that I've had several questions on is the timing of when you, plan to build something, how much time it takes to prepare in order to present your project. And it's not only that, I understand, it's also understanding the culture of the area that you're building, or you will be building your project, and everything that surrounds it. So that takes time too. And I'm just reflecting back to the one that you built in India, where there was so much controversy about you being the one chosen to build, and yet there's nothing but accolades now that it's done. But it took time to set that up.
Well, but it goes back to one of the sort of underlying beliefs or principles that I've had, which is that it started evolving for me after Habitat, when I began working in Jerusalem, and I had several projects that were in or around the ancient walled city. And the big question was, can you build contemporary buildings, which are authentic, contemporary modern buildings, which are in harmony with the heritage of the city, with the stone architecture and the scale and the texture of old Jerusalem. And, you know, many assume that that's an impossibility. But to me, the challenge was to make a building that feels really that it belongs, and that you need to adapt it to its place. And after Jerusalem came the National Gallery, which, you know, sits in neo-Gothic Ottawa, just across from Parliament, and the same question recurred: can I make a building that is a contemporary museum, and it has the kind of spaces a museum requires, and it's a very extrovert public building, transparent and inviting, but harmonious with the Ottawa setting and harmonious with its climate, as the coldest capital in the world, we were told at the time, probably still is. That came, so the building that emerged is, to my mind, very much quintessentially Ottawa. And that philosophy then carried forward. So when we were commissioned to design the National Museum of the Sikhs, and it was an improbable commission because it occurred as a result of the visit of the Chief Minister of Punjab in Israel, where there is an agricultural support program between the two countries. And he was taken to Yad Vashem, the Holocaust Museum, which I designed, deeply moved, asked to meet the architect. Next thing I know is I'm in India, commissioned to do the National Museum. And there was, I think, a reasonable kind of doubt. What is this outsider, Canadian, Israeli, certainly not of the Sikh faith, know about us to design the Museum of the Sikhs? And I spent a lot of time really immersing myself in the culture, in the scriptures, with religious scholars. I knew India. I spent a lot of time in India, but specifically the Punjabi Sikh culture. And the nice thing is that when it was built, it was totally embraced. I mean, you could see that even on the inauguration, when thousands of Sikhs showed up and completely embraced the building.
Well, it's a fascinating building, and you know, when you look at the slides that we've seen today, and you know, your reach goes so much further around the world. It's just incredible. I have a question here that says, you know, we're going through a housing crisis now, and it's just not here. There's a housing crisis going on around the world. But in particular here, what needs to be done by government and citizens alike in order to address this?
I mean, it's a vast question because it touches on so many different issues of urbanism, not just housing design, but urbanism. I mean, I suppose one of the big questions facing Canadian cities is the balance between urban living and suburban sprawl. Toronto is a city in which a remarkable number of people live in apartment buildings. But still there is extraordinary suburban spread around the metropolitan city. Toronto raises questions about how dense is too dense. I look at downtown Toronto and I say, maybe that's going too far with density. Certainly on the waterfront, as it's been developed, one wonders, does it need to be that density? So one of the problems of Canadian development is it's developer driven. And we need to strengthen the planning agencies of cities who need to come with affirmative positions about the appropriate density and guidelines. In that sense, Singapore is a very interesting example of a proactive planning agency that sets the densities ahead of the developers, brings the infrastructure ahead of development. I think so that the whole issue of public transit, the balance between how much we spend on roads versus transit system, altogether, it seems to me we're on the edge of a major change in transportation. That between cars on demand, self-driving cars, I'm not sure which comes first and when they come, they're going to change the way we plan our cities. In terms of individual building practice, we're seeing a lot of extruded business as usual apartment buildings. And in that respect, it's interesting to see that there's much more experimentation and adventure in Asian cities about housing. You see what we got built in China and in Singapore and elsewhere. And for some sad reason, there still is less experimentation, or even the word experimentation is inappropriate. I'd say less exploration of humanizing the apartment building, creating more public spaces, more outdoor spaces. And COVID was a big lesson. I mean, I remember people living in luxury buildings in New York complaining that they can't open the window. They not only don't have a balcony, but they can't open their window. The windows are not openable, and here they are prisoners in their own dwelling and not even unable to breathe the outside air. So we've come out of COVID, I think, with a few lessons about housing design.
Yeah, I agree with that on the basis that you saw such almost migration out of the cities into the country.
Correct.
In order to get that space and that sense of being able to open your windows and be outside. So it's quite something. We thought of COVID as it had its pretty bad moments, but I think some really interesting things have come out of it. I have questions here regarding sort of technology. How has that changed your way of doing business? And I'm just thinking back to the archives where everything that I saw you did by hand, and your thesis is typed up on a typewriter. And things have changed so much now that the use of technology has certainly advanced things beyond probably your wildest dreams.
Well, yes and no. So it's interesting to reflect on that question. The way we create architecture has totally transformed. Architecture used to be very labor intensive. You drew by hand, you erased by hand. Every change in the plans had to be accomplished by drawing. There was little flexibility in that respect, and model making similarly. And today, the designing of architecture, the creation, not only the architecture side, but the engineering side, is completely supported by CAD, by computer-aided design, we are able to, in short time, a few days, get a whole building three-dimensionally digitized. We can walk around it. We can see what's inside it. For me, it still doesn't replace physical models, which are very, very helpful, but they're still an amazing tool. And then our drawings can be then translated straight into production so that the computer drawing can become the instructor for either a 3D printer or a cutter or a fabricator. And so all of that is revolutionary. But the building practice, the materials we use, and the way we build has hardly changed in 60 years. I mean, when you think about it, you go to a construction site, it's a big mess. It's not like an assembly plant where you go and see cars assembled, the pieces arrive, they all fit, either hands or robots put them together, and it all clicks one after the other. You can see on a construction site, everything is hand adapted. It's done in different circumstances, in winter, when you're exposed to the weather, etc. And for any of you who built a house or done a renovation, how many things are done twice? Just think about it. How many things are done? They're not right. They got to be changed. There's a mistake here, the mistake there. So construction, and then concrete is still concrete, and steel is steel, and there has not been a revolution in building materials, except perhaps glass. What we can do with glass as it has transformed, but otherwise, I'd say our hope that there'll be a magic material, half the weight of concrete, waterproof, insulating, that has not happened. So I think the research and development of new construction processes and materials is yet to come. It's not occurred. And it's surprising given the changes in other industries.
It is surprising, especially when you're thinking, 60 years, because there's always questions about the concrete at Habitat 67. How has that managed to survive the test of time?
With too much maintenance. I mean, to be honest, it does require maintenance because concrete, particularly in Montreal's climate, freezing and thawing and so on, and expanding and shrinking. And, one does hope that we'll have materials like concrete, but I mean, concrete has a lot of qualities going for it, but it's not very strong in tension. You got to reinforce it. And it's not very good with water because there's surface cracks and then the water can get in. So that there's a long way to improve concrete. And then steel, as we know, when there's a fire, melts. So we need to fireproof it. And so for now, any building over, say, 5-6 stories is still built fundamentally in the same way we did. Now, where there's a big changes in timber, we have things like cross-laminated timber, laminated beams. We are now developing 3D housing modules that can go up to 8 stories made out of timber, and not and timber, sustainable timber. In other words, small pieces of wood that are then processed to become strong panels or beams or columns. And I think that is an expanding market, and Canada is leading in that respect, that market.
Oh, interesting. There's concern over, weather, like earthquakes, tsunamis in parts of the world that you're building projects in. Do you have to take that into account when you're designing these buildings?
Of course, anywhere you build, you need to deal with the particular risks and threats. The risk, in some places, for example, in Hong Kong, the big issue is wind, typhoons, or Florida for that matter. In other places like California, it's winds and fire, it's earthquake and fire. But the problem is not our knowledge of how to do that, which that's been highly advanced, particularly with computer engineering, computerized engineering, so that you look at a city like San Francisco and you see towers which are 80, 90 stories high. And in all probability, even with a strong earthquake, they'll survive. But then you see an earthquake in Turkey where half the city disappears. And that's not because we don't know how to build. That's because of corruption and people not adhering to building codes, and people cutting corners and bribing inspectors. And so the big problem in many countries is sloppiness of construction and corruption. And I've noticed, for example, in countries like China, the building codes are much stricter. It seems to demand more structure, heavier structure, more columns, more concrete. And I one starts analyzing why. And I think the Chinese code assumes that there's going to be sloppy construction, and therefore it overcompensates for that by asking for heavier buildings. But heavier buildings are not always stronger buildings, particularly for earthquake. So I think we have advanced a lot, but now we need to find ways of enforcing it, particularly in countries where there isn't as, let's call it, law and order in terms of the inspection system and the adhering to building codes.
Many of our participants today seem concerned, of course, about climate change. And so they've asked about integrating solar power, the use of your glass. You do use a lot of glass in your construction. So they just, is there a way to integrate it? Are you integrating it so that it is aesthetically attractive, I guess, and workable within your framework?
I think it's a good question. To me, one of the benefits of contemporary architecture is the ability to create transparency and to bring the outside in and the inside out, and to experience nature in a much more comprehensive way than traditional architecture enabled us. But at the same time, we build in many different climates, and each of them has its challenges. So it drives me crazy to go to Abu Dhabi or Dubai or somewhere super hot and see those all glass office towers totally exposed, no shading. And the response to climate is that they make it like sunglasses. It's almost black glass or blue glass, trying to keep the heat out in a place that has 40 degrees centigrade, 50 degrees centigrade. So if you want transparency, first of all, I think you should use clear glass. I personally abhor tinted glass because it always shows you what's outside like a gray day. I mean, it just transforms the experience of what light is all about. And to do that, you've got to positively shade it. So if you're in a hot climate, it has to be deep overhangs or outside shutters, outside the building, not inside the building, that stop the heat and shade the glass. And that's responsible design. So sustainability is to achieve the qualities you want with responsible response to climate, not to compromise it by, for example, not achieving the transparency. And the same is true of insulating buildings, of the way we. And the tragedy is that there is this kind of universal standard solution, and you get the same office buildings in Dubai and in Beijing and in Toronto and in the coldest cities in the world and the hottest cities in the world. And it does not seem to be a willing of the architecture profession to seriously adapt the architecture to the particular climate.
Very interesting.
It'll be richer for it too, because we now come into a city, and whether it's the airport or the mall, you don't know where you are. I mean, it's just the same everywhere.
Well, given that we don't have much time left, and I wanted to address the archives because right now, I was going to say in 1990, I think it was in 1990, the early 90s, you donated part of your archives. And I know recently it's been very much in the news that there's more coming. And as I've had the benefit of touring the archives with Tellina the other day and being able to see what's there. And as I told you, I had a great conversation with the original curator, Irina, and she was telling this story about how when back in the 90s, just trying to get I think it was close to 100,000. I'm just looking. Yeah, it was close to 100,000 pieces that were coming, items that were coming up to McGill, and they had to send down a van, and it was classified as, and I'm just going to check to make sure that I've got it, was classified as an important archive of a McGill graduate. And as it came to the border, the customs agents wanted to charge duty, and this just was unfathomable. I mean, it just wasn't sort of in the cards. They didn't understand it, and it ended up getting advice from the broker and from the customs that if you changed the collection that was coming across to be labeled as a collection of old papers, that it would get across duty free. In fact, it did. So I'm just looking at the next phase of the next collection that's coming up. I hope it'll be a lot easier to get across and come in. But we're very grateful. I mean, we're all very grateful that McGill is the home of your archives, and that it will be preserved, and allow research to be done, allow for students to have access, which I think is very important. And I mean, not just from McGill, but from around the world. And I know that as we introduce, Tellina is going to tell us a little bit more, as she's the incoming curator. But we've got drawings in there, we've got sketches, there's some models. I didn't see the models, I didn't have time, but I'm going back to see the models.
They're in a warehouse, there's hundreds of models.
Well, I think those would be quite something, because you did show us a slide of models that you had done that sort of seemed to be probably quite interesting to look at in person. But and you mentioned the pledge of your apartment down at Habitat 67, and I think that will be quite something for the research, for further research going forward. And you had an interesting story about the refrigerator. What happened with the refrigerator?
Well, when the government declared my unit to be heritage, it meant that whatever occurs in it has to be approved by the appropriate department in the cultural ministry. And so we submitted the plans for the restoration of the unit. We gutted it, re-insulated it. And one of the things I had proposed is changing my refrigerator that was 50 years old. And they said, no, you've got to restore your old 50-year-old refrigerator and stick by it. But we negotiated it at the end that will keep the outside door so it looks exactly the same, but inside I have a new refrigerator that might function a little more reliably. That's the refrigerator story. But by the way, we did, for Habitat, develop the first stacked washer dryer, because none existed in 67. And we wanted in our bathroom to have a compact stacking of the two. And Frigidaire, the company Frigidaire at the time, developed for us the first stacked unit. But happily, I have a new stack unit in the apartment now. So not that I'm using it, but whoever needs to use it in the future.
It's there. All these little interesting things that we weren't privy to before now. But thank you. I'd like to thank you so much for taking the time to spend with us today. It's been enlightening, inspiring, incredibly interesting, which are all words that everyone knows about you anyway, as a person, as a citizen of the world. So thank you very much for the time. I encourage everybody to take time, if you do, to go and see the archives and visit Habitat again. I love the photo from the river looking at the city, because we've always been looking at Habitat from the port, looking at the front of it as it faces the river, as opposed to the river facing the facing the city. Just an iconic building. Anyway, thank you.
The memoir is if walls could speak, Atlantic Press.
If Walls Could Speak, and it's interesting because you had the original title they had proposed was If the Walls Would Talk, or The Walls Could Talk. You said
that sounded
no,
too
no.
gossipy.
Too gossipy. Well, it turns out that Celine Dion has a song, If Walls Could Talk. So, but your book is enlightening, fascinating read, and came out, I think, in the fall of
Right.
of last year. So highly recommended. And I hope we'll see you again soon. I hope you'll come and visit us up at McGill and see what we're doing, and it would be wonderful. It would be absolutely wonderful.
Thanks very much. Bye-bye.
And I just want to take the time now, as we transition to Tellina Liu, who is the archivist for McGill's Library's Moshe Safdie's archive. She is arrived in January and is like up to speed, or mostly up to speed. I was quite impressed when I was there the other day. And of course, it's housed in the rare books and special collections. And so it was a privilege. And I'm so glad you're with us. And I'm glad that MCLL is going to bring you back a little later on, because Tellina is quite fascinating. She's got quite a lot of work ahead of her as more of Moshe's collection arrives at McGill, and even with the current one, and with the new library expansion, that's going to be quite a challenge. Tellina studied architecture at Berkeley, and was in fact inspired by Moshe Safdie at the time. So it's interesting how this has come almost full circle. No, let's just say it has come full circle. And then went on to take a master's in historic preservation at Columbia, and then a master's in archives, preservation, and records management at the University of Pittsburgh. And so there's quite a lot of background there. She's worked in the archives of MoMA, the Museum of Modern Art in New York, being involved in the processing and cataloging, interestingly enough, of Andy Warhol's time capsules at the Andy Warhol Museum, and has even delved into the archives of the world's largest Coke memorabilia collection at Coca-Cola headquarters in Atlanta. And that's just to name a few of a long list of achievements and experiences. So welcome, Tellina. The floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Cynthia, for that very kind introduction. I'm going to share my slide presentation now. Hope everyone can see that. I would also like to thank the McGill Community for Lifelong Learning for inviting me here to speak with you all today. And like Cynthia mentioned, my name is Tellina Liu, and since January of this year, I've been the archivist here at McGill University, focusing on the Moshe Safdie archival collection. As an archivist who studied architecture, historic preservation, and worked as a preservation architect before transitioning to archives, I'm so excited and thrilled to have this opportunity to collaborate with Safdie architects and to promote awareness of and access to this collection. The archive is located at the McLennan Library, pictured here, and we welcome visitors and researchers who want to view, visit, and use the Safdie archive. The archive came to McGill in 1990, and the materials here reflect roughly the first half of Safdie's career and begins with his university work. Currently, we have more than 80,000 architectural drawings, but we also have sketchbooks, models, photographs, and project files. All of the drawings are either stored flat in archival folders or rolled in tubes to best preserve the archival materials and to ensure longevity for access and research. Project files and photographs are also housed in the appropriate archival materials and stored in boxes. One of Safdie's landmark projects is, of course, Habitat 67, and we have extensive documentation of the project in the archive. There are approximately 150 folders of just architectural drawings and sketches, although, of course, we have other formats as well, which include project files, photographs, and models. Here are additional drawings of Habitat, including one of the original proposals seen here on the left. As an archivist and one-time architecture student, the presence of early concept sketches and drawings are incredibly valuable for students and provide a glimpse into the architect's design process. These materials also show that an architectural design results from an iterative process and that changes are part of an architect's career. Beyond Habitat, we also have other project documentation. One of the major projects in the collection is the National Gallery located in Ottawa and is represented in multiple formats, including sketches and models. The collection also contains documentation for unbuilt projects like the drawing and model seen here. These materials are from the Frobisher Bay Housing Project for the Inuit community, and this major project by Safdie shows the importance of archival documentation and collections. Having archival materials for unbuilt projects provide a fuller and more complete understanding of a designer's architectural career. As I learn and discover more about the Safdie Archive, I'm interested in increasing the awareness of and use of all of the projects here, including the lesser known buildings and unbuilt sites. A major focus for any archivist is to provide access and promote collection use. An access point into the collection is the Moshe Safdie Archive website shown here. This can be accessed through McGill's website or via search engine. The website acts as a digital finding aid, and researchers can browse by project or explore project themes. Each project contains a description and images, and if the archival materials are currently here at McGill, users can also see the formats and the number of items available to view in the archive. McGill is a research institution and university, and as such, we want to ensure that students are made aware of our collections and are able to access them. To do that, we work with different departments and faculty here at McGill. This semester, we collaborated with Safdie Architects to provide digital access for the Telfair Museum of Art in Savannah, Georgia, for a class on digital representation. This collection isn't here at McGill yet, and so the collaboration with Safdie Architects was crucial. And just last week, we provided a tour of the Safdie Archive to undergraduate students studying architectural history here at McGill in the School of Architecture. Exhibits are another way to increase the reach of the archives, and colleagues prior to my tenure here have included Safdie Archive materials in exhibitions held on campus. The photo here shows a vitrine from an exhibition held in 2017 to celebrate the 50th anniversary of Expo 67 and includes a habitat study model as well as Safdie's undergraduate thesis report. A touchscreen display was also part of that exhibition, and visitors were able to view and interact with archival photographs from Habitat. Archivists are always thinking of new ways to promote collection materials, as well as how to utilize technology to increase user interactivity and to provide new access points into our holdings. And looking further beyond the McGill campus and community, previous efforts to promote Safdie Archive materials also include collaborations with other institutions. This often involved loans of our archival material to those institutions for traveling exhibitions. As seen in these images, the Global Citizen exhibition traveled to different institutions between 2011 and 2016, and the exhibition featured archival materials from our collection. A more recent exhibition was held at Boston Architectural College and just closed in January of 2023. With intention to build the unrealized concepts, ideas, and dreams of Moshe Safdie, included models lent from our Safdie collection. All of these examples show the work that has been done and is currently being done to promote the collection, to increase visibility of, and to provide access to the Safdie archive. And while I want to continue the great work of my colleagues, I also want to build on that foundation. I want to strive for more outreach, to provide greater access to and use of the collection, and to find additional audiences for the archive. One way I believe that we can do that is to increase the digital presence of the collection. And one potential project is to work with Safdie architects to make accessible his already digitized sketchbooks. Here are images from the Marina Bay Sands Integrated Resort on the left and Crystal Bridges Museum of American Art on the right. This will necessarily include collaboration with colleagues at McGill and potentially from outside institutions, but I'm excited to explore this and other possibilities. And just as a note, the Epic Games video, they actually scanned drawings from the archive, and drone footage of the built site was used for that project. And I want to thank, again, the McGill Community for Lifelong Learning for inviting me to speak today. And I also want to thank Moshe Safdie for the generous gift of his professional collection to the university, and which has provided me the opportunity to work with and make accessible this amazing architectural archive. Thank you all so much. Cynthia, I believe you're on mute.
You'd think I'd learn by now, honestly. This is so exciting, Tellina, and I can hear it in your voice, in the tone of your voice. And, you know, there's the whole research role going forward that I wanted to just ask you how you see that research role of the archives in the future, because it's even beyond the students themselves. And then my other question, well, I'll ask you my other question after, so we'll leave you with that one.
Sure. I mean, like I mentioned, I think the main focus is to provide research opportunities to students here at McGill in Montreal, but also in universities and locations beyond Canada. We are always open to researchers here. I'm in communication with different faculty, and I would like to potentially, speak with faculty from different schools. I think we're considering collaboration with other institutions. How can we digitize more materials and make them accessible on the website so that students and researchers who maybe can't make it to Montreal and cannot make it to McGill will be able to access the materials digitally, to be able to see the drawings and see images of the models and the other archival material online for their research. So it's a lot of work and it's going to take many steps, but I'm very excited to, again, expand on the work that's already happened and to make it more widely accessible.
So you've got quite a few challenges ahead, but knowing that there's quite a bit more of Safdie's collection coming to McGill. How do you see that? I mean, how are you preparing to receive that?
So that's also a complicated question. Partially, the Fiat Lux project is going to be happening, so the library will be in a little bit of flux, physically speaking, for several years. But this is where the collaboration with Safdie Architects is also really helpful. We are going to, look at what space we will have during the renovation work, and we're going to look at the projects that we believe maybe have the most research value immediately, or might be used in exhibitions or for lectures. And those might be the ones that would come to the university first, or perhaps it's that Safdie will, hold on to the drawings and just make them available for these types of activities. When the renovation is complete, it will take a whole team of us and other departments at McGill to determine the priorities for which projects we think would be the most useful here, and then work sort of through that list of priorities. So we, couldn't possibly get one shipment of, the second half of his career. That would be an enormous task for, I think, everyone involved. So we'll have a list of priorities, and we'll just constantly be in communication with them and work with them to figure out the best method and way to accession and to receive those materials into the collection here at McGill.
Sounds like you might need to do a call to action to the volunteers out there to come and lend a hand. Is it, the donation of a living architect of his archives while he's alive is quite a different thing than the past, where we receive the archives after the person has passed away. So I think it's kind of cool that we have them now, or we're getting more, and that we're able to talk to him and talk to his architects and be able to work with him in prioritizing in various aspects. Would you agree?
Oh, absolutely. And I think one of the most amazing things about being able to collaborate with them is that if we have questions about any of the archival material, we can ask him directly, or he is available to provide additional context. We can ask him questions about projects. I know that there are discussions that maybe Moshe Safdie will do some oral histories, and we could work with him and have him speak to specific projects. And then that will create additional material and additional archival content that I think will help students and researchers, and is just a wonderful resource that we have, because this is a collection of a living architect.
And there's nothing like collecting the stories, and he certainly has stories. So good luck with that. So thank you very much, Tellina, for joining us today. I think that was interesting for all those that have joined us today, and there's hundreds of people that have joined us today, to just bring that into the conversation about his works and what McGill is doing, and how proud we are of being able to have his archives under the McGill University roof. So thank you again. We'll be seeing you again.